I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Mom's Favorites, Books My Mother Loved, a memorial for my mother. A memorial that has been going on now for a good 2 years and some, and I have books yet to go on this list, so there you go. So the book this week is a book that, much like Julia Child's My Life in France, is very much a book that I look at and I say, oh yeah, this is Mom. Because there were aspects of my mother that I never knew as an adult because of the various psychological, psychiatric issues that she had, the various disability issues that she had, but there were parts of her that I did know. I lived with my parents and was still living with my parents upon her death because I am one of those sad people who never makes it out of the basement. Also because they're not going to charge me rent and I live in an expensive city. But the thing is, the Alice Toklas Cook Book is partly a cookbook and it's partly a memoir. But the thing is that it's not a cookbook for people who are trying to learn to cook or who are looking for great recipes that you can work with or what have you. The thing is that a lot of these recipes are written in the way that somebody who has made this recipe 800 times will write the recipe. That is, you know the recipe so well that there are steps that you omit when you're telling people this because you think it's obvious. There are a lot of times when it says, include this kind of sauce, and you're not going to find an associated recipe for that. The book just assumes that, either you know it or you're not going to be cooking it, or possibly you can dig up a recipe for that yourself, but go make your own. We're not going to tell you how to do it. There's also the fact that a properly designed recipe, a typically designed recipe, will usually include things like, if you are supposed to put a mixture of X, Y, and Z together, it will say, while this is boiling, chop this and do this and add this so that it is ready when your things are finished boiling to add the mixture to your sauce or whatever. Or it will say pre-prepare this because you will need it later. This book, it'll reach that point, it'll say, and add in a thing for and add in your mixture made up of this, this, and this, and this. And so it's poorly designed as recipes for people who want to use a book as a recipe book, as a book that will tell them how to make stuff. There are, of course, also times when she throws in side comments about how she likes this or doesn't like this, or, cooked lettuce appears to be, well, she doesn't say cooked lettuce is an abomination, but she's very, very close to it, and of course she's right. But the point is that she has a certain number of not quite parenthetical remarks that don't really belong in recipes. There's also a tendency to write things like, the lemon, champagne, and coriander seeds give an ineffable flavor. There are a great many things that have ineffable flavors. Flavors that are not described. They are not described as strong or salty or sweet or or anything. They're described using words like ineffable. And the difficulty with ineffable is that something that is ineffable is something that is unknowable. God's will is ineffable. It's not the kind of thing that one normally uses to describe food, if for no other reason than that very few people will appreciate being told that a flavor is ineffable, if only because then they don't know what that flavor actually may be, and it's unhelpful in deciding whether or not you want to try something. So there is that, but as I said, this is also very much a memoir. This is a book in which she talks about how they survived in occupied France during World War II, how she and Gertrude Stein, because Alice Toklas was Gertrude Stein's what today would be a common law spouse, because today it's actually legal, but back then was kind of two spinsters living together, and we're just going to not inquire too closely about what's going on. But it's there's a lot of memories about, there's a lot of things in this book. And the other thing, well, let's move on to pictures, because we have a portrait of Alice B. Toklas by Dora Maar, as photographed by Maurice Poplin. This is the back cover of the book, of Alice Toklas and one of their dogs, because she and Gertrude Stein had two dogs, and I'm guessing that that's supposed to be one of their dogs. I could be wrong. It's hard to tell. Anyways, this is the interior cover, and on the interior cover, for example, you have pictures that are sort of connected to various places that they had lived in, places that they visited, places that things happened in. You have this picture here, this thing of a guy and a track. Track is identified in this book, which, by the way, was published in 1954. Track is identified as, I believe, Indo-Chinese. So where he's actually from is anybody's guess, although clearly East Asian. And he worked for them for a while as a cook, and he was apparently an excellent cook, and so you have him managing to be memorialized here. The titles of the chapters, the various chapters in this book, this isn't told in any particular chronological order. You have the first chapter, which is the French tradition, food in French homes. And these are both chapters about French food and how the French approach food. And that's because, of course, Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas lived in France for a great many years and are in France in many of the memories of this in this book. Murder in the Kitchen, which comes right after Dishes for Artists. And Dishes for Artists, by the by, was dishes that Alice Toklas made for people like Picasso, because, she was living with Gertrude Stein, who had access to people like that. Murder in the Kitchen is the chapter that is very bluntly about the fact that if you're going to be cooking fish or squab or any other animal, that animal has to die at some point. And she's very blunt about having to learn to deal with the act of clubbing a fish to death or chopping its head off or what have you, because these are things that you have to learn to do if you're going to be a chef, or a cook, particularly in times and places when you don't have good storage facilities. And France, back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, did not have the world's greatest storage facilities, and food had to be fresh and kept fresh because otherwise, had to be usually bought fresh because you didn't have great freezers, and so there was a lot more of having to kill the damn fish in your own kitchen. So she's very blunt about that. This is one of the interior illustrations. There are a great many interior illustrations, all that are all done by Sir Francis Rose, as was said on the cover. There's a food which Aunt Pauline and Lady Godiva led us, to which Aunt Pauline and Lady Godiva were the names that they gave their two cars, one after another, that they would get lost while driving and sort of said the cars led us to these places. Treasures is a collection of recipes just that she had saved, that Alice Toklas had saved from her childhood. Happy memories, recipes that she picked up just off the cuff in various places. Food in the United States in 1934 and 1935, which is a particular speaking tour that Gertrude Stein went on, and Alice, going with her, collected recipes from people that they met with, ate with, stayed with while on that trip. Servants in France is a discussion of various servants they had, because remember that this is a book that's primarily set in the World War II and pre-war eras, and back then domestic servants were still affordable for ordinary people. These days, having domestic servants is fundamentally prohibitive for nearly everybody except the extremely wealthy, but back then, lower middle class families would have somebody who could be classed as a servant. You have food in the bougie during the occupation, which is very much about how they survived, how they ate during the German occupation of France during World War II, because during the war, because the thing is, when you're occupied, when you're in there were, of course, the various limits that were placed, the various limitations that were placed on what could be made, because, it's during a war, people aren't managing to make quite as much food, the various farmers are, on the front lines and so on and so forth. But the thing is that the thing is, though, that also occupied France was under even more stringent regulations because they were occupied territory and the Germans were trying to keep the French suppressed. So there's a lot of talk about things that they were getting on the black market, a lot of talk about, and we're no longer allowed to fish in the river, and so your fishing gets done surreptitiously. There's a lot of discussion of that, as well as of just how they were making do with what they could manage to get a hold of. This is from the chapter of recipes from friends, where she's just applied to a bunch of friends for recipes that they liked, and this is frankly one of those pictures that I always find disturbing, because it's a picture of, people made out of food, because if you look really closely, you can see that all of these people are made out of, melons or tomatoes or whatever those are there, and leaves of some kind, and round fruits over here, and maybe there are some bananas there, and that's half a melon, and those sorts of things, those sorts of pictures are frankly always upsetting to me. Anyway, so this is a memoir, and it's about food and just going through life and discussing food, and Yeah, it's a very mom book. My mom, anyways. So that's everything, and I will see you all next week.